June 15, 1991. Clearwater, Oregon. A town of 12,000 residents nestled in the Pacific Northwest, where neighbors knew each other by name and children rode bicycles freely through tree-lined streets. On this particular Saturday afternoon, the summer sun hung bright in a cloudless sky, and 12-year-old Jacob Morrison prepared to make what should have been a simple errand to the corner store. So glad to have you here. Comment your city so I can bring cases from your region and also know where you're watching me from. Jacob lived with his mother, Jennifer Morrison, and his younger sister, Emily, in a modest 2-story house on Maple Street. Jennifer, a 32-year-old elementary school teacher, had divorced Jacob's father 3 years earlier. The family had adjusted to their new circumstances, finding stability and routine and the support of their tight-knit community. Jacob was known as a responsible child, mature for his age, someone his mother trusted to run small errands without supervision. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, Jacob asked his mother for money to buy soda from the Quick Stop convenience store, located just 3 blocks away on the corner of Maple and 5th Street. Jennifer handed him $5 and reminded him to return home within 30 minutes. Jacob grabbed his bicycle from the garage, a red mountain bike he had received for his birthday the previous year, and pedaled down the quiet street. His mother watched from the front porch as he turned the corner and disappeared from view. It would be the last time she would see her son. When 3:30 passed without Jacob's return, Jennifer felt the first stirrings of concern. By 4 o'clock, that concern had transformed into worry. She walked to the Quick Stop herself, expecting to find Jacob chatting with friends or distracted by the magazine rack near the entrance. The store clerk, a woman named Michelle Reynolds who knew the Morrison family well, confirmed that Jacob had indeed visited the store around 2:45. He had purchased a bottle of cola and left through the front door. Michelle remembered the transaction clearly because Jacob had been polite and cheerful, exactly as he always was. Jennifer's anxiety intensified. She returned home and began calling the parents of Jacob's friends, hoping he had stopped to play basketball or video games and simply lost track of time. None of them had seen him that afternoon. As the hours stretched toward evening, Jennifer contacted her ex-husband David and several neighbors, organizing an informal search of the immediate area. They walked the streets calling Jacob's name, checking parks, vacant lots, and the small wooded areas that bordered the residential neighborhood. Nothing. At 7:15, as darkness began to settle over Clearwater, Jennifer Morrison called the police department. Detective Richard Palmer, a 15-year veteran of the force, arrived at the Morrison residence within 20 minutes. Palmer was a methodical investigator, respected in the community for his thoroughness and dedication. He listened carefully as Jennifer described the afternoon's events, taking detailed notes and asking questions about Jacob's habits, friends, and any recent changes in his behavior or routine. Palmer immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. While many missing children cases involved runaways or simple miscommunications, the circumstances surrounding Jacob's disappearance raised immediate red flags. The boy had no history of running away, no apparent conflicts at home or school, and no reason to vanish voluntarily. Moreover, the timeline was disturbingly tight. Less than 5 hours had passed since Jacob left home, yet he had seemingly vanished without a trace in a 3-block radius. The Clearwater Police Department launched a full-scale search operation that evening. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors and interviewing residents. They focused particular attention on the route between the Morrison home and the Quick Stop, searching yards, alleyways, and any location where a child might be hidden or injured. Search and rescue volunteers arrived with trained dogs, attempting to track Jacob's scent from the convenience store. The trail led south along 5th Street for approximately 2 blocks before inexplicably ending near a residential intersection. Detective Palmer returned to the Quick Stop to review the security camera footage. The store had a single camera positioned above the cash register, offering a grainy black-and-white view of the checkout counter and part of the entrance. The footage confirmed Michelle Reynolds' account. At 2:43 in the afternoon, Jacob Morrison entered the frame, approached the cooler at the edge of the camera's view, and returned with a bottle of cola. He paid for his purchase, received his change, and walked toward the exit. The final image showed him pushing open the glass door, the bottle clutched in his right hand. Then he stepped outside and out of the camera's limited field of vision. Palmer interviewed every person who had been in or near the quick stop that afternoon. Several customers remembered seeing Jacob, describing him as a pleasant boy in a blue t-shirt and jeans, riding a red bicycle. One witness, an elderly man named Charles Henderson, mentioned noticing a white van parked along 5th Street, approximately half a block from the convenience store. Henderson couldn't provide detailed information about the vehicle or its driver, noting only that it seemed out of place in the residential area. When pressed for more details, he acknowledged that his memory was uncertain and he couldn't be sure the van was even there on that specific day. The investigation expanded throughout the night and into the following days. Police checked every registered sex offender within a 50-mile radius of Clearwater, interviewing each one and verifying their whereabouts on June 15th. None provided any leads. Detectives examined Jacob's bicycle, which was never found, theorizing that its absence suggested the boy had been taken while riding rather than while on foot. This detail troubled Palmer deeply. It implied a level of planning or opportunism that pointed toward an abduction rather than a tragic accident. Local media coverage intensified as the search continued. Jacob's photograph appeared on television news broadcasts and in newspapers throughout Oregon. The image showed a smiling boy with brown hair and hazel eyes, wearing his school portrait's formal pose. Jennifer Morrison made tearful appeals for information, begging anyone with knowledge of her son's whereabouts to come forward. The community rallied around the family, organizing volunteer search parties that combed through nearby forests, fields, and waterways. Despite these extensive efforts, no trace of Jacob Morrison emerged. Detective Palmer pursued every possible lead, no matter how tenuous. He investigated reports of suspicious vehicles, interviewed transients passing through the area, and followed up on dozens of tips called in by concerned citizens. Each lead ultimately led nowhere. The case began to take on a haunting quality. A child had vanished in broad daylight from a safe neighborhood, leaving behind no witnesses, no evidence, and no explanation. It defied logic and challenged everything Palmer understood about criminal investigations. As weeks turned into months, the active search efforts gradually diminished. The police department maintained the case as open and ongoing, but the initial urgency faded as other crimes demanded attention and resources. Jennifer Morrison refused to accept that her son was gone forever. She kept Jacob's room exactly as he had left it, his clothes still hanging in the closet, his baseball glove resting on the dresser. Every year, on June 15th, she organized memorial vigils and renewed searches, keeping her son's memory alive in a community that struggled to comprehend such a profound tragedy. The white van mentioned by Charles Henderson became a recurring element in the investigation, though its significance remained unclear. Palmer attempted to track down every white van registered in the county, a task that proved overwhelming given the vehicle's commonality. Without additional identifying information, the van remained a tantalizing but ultimately useless clue. It existed in the case file as a question mark, a potential piece of a puzzle that refused to come together. By the end of 1991, the Jacob Morrison case had gone cold. The file remained on Detective Palmer's desk, a constant reminder of the boy who had walked out of a convenience store and into oblivion. Palmer would retire years later without solving the case, carrying the weight of that failure with him. For Jennifer Morrison and her daughter Emily, life continued in the shadow of Jacob's absence, marked by birthdays never celebrated and questions never answered. The town of Clearwater slowly returned to its normal rhythms, though the memory of that June afternoon lingered like an unhealed wound. What no one could have known in 1991 was that Jacob Morrison had left behind a message, a desperate plea for help sealed in glass and carried away by water. That message would remain hidden for 28 years, waiting for the precise moment when fate would bring it back to light and finally begin to unravel the mystery of what happened on that sunny Saturday afternoon. The investigation into Jacob Morrison's disappearance continued through the remainder of 1991 and into 1992, though with diminishing intensity as leads evaporated and hope faded. Detective Richard Palmer remained committed to the case, dedicating whatever time he could spare from his other duties to reviewing evidence and pursuing new angles. He maintained regular contact with Jennifer Morrison, updating her on the investigation's progress or more accurately, its lack thereof. Each conversation grew more difficult as Palmer found himself repeating the same frustrating message. Despite their best efforts, the police had found no concrete evidence of what had happened to her son. In 1995, a significant shift occurred in the investigation when Detective Angela Martinez transferred to the Clearwater Police Department from Portland. Martinez, 38 years old with a reputation for tenacity and innovative investigative techniques, requested assignment to the cold case unit. The Jacob Morrison file was among the first cases she examined. Unlike Palmer, who had lived through the initial investigation and carried the emotional weight of those frantic early days, Martinez approached the case with fresh eyes and no preconceived assumptions about what had or had not happened. Martinez spent months reviewing every document, photograph, and witness statement in the case file. She created detailed timelines, mapped out Jacob's last known movements, and identified gaps in the original investigation. Her methodical approach revealed several areas that deserved renewed attention. The white van mentioned by Charles Henderson particularly interested her. While Palmer had attempted to track down white vans in the immediate area, Martinez expanded the search parameters, recognizing that an abductor would likely have come from outside Clearwater's small community, where strangers would be more noticeable. In early 1996, Martinez began the painstaking process of re-interviewing everyone who had provided statements during the original investigation. Many of the witnesses had moved away from Clearwater in the intervening years, requiring Martinez to track them down across Oregon and neighboring states. Some had died. Others had difficulty remembering details from 5 years earlier. However, Martinez's patient and systematic approach occasionally yielded new information that had been forgotten or deemed unimportant during the initial investigation. One such interview involved a woman named Nicole Stevens, who had been 17 years old in June 1991. Nicole had been working her summer job at a garden supply store on 5th Street, approximately 4 blocks from the Quick Stop. During the original investigation, she had been briefly questioned and stated she had seen nothing unusual that day. When Martinez interviewed her again in 1996, Nicole mentioned a detail she hadn't thought significant at the time. She recalled seeing a white van parked near the alley behind the garden supply store that afternoon. The van had struck her as odd because it remained parked in the same spot for several hours, and she remembered noticing a man sitting in the driver's seat, apparently waiting for something or someone. Martinez pressed Nicole for additional details about the man and the van. Nicole's memory was understandably hazy after 5 years, but she recalled that the man appeared to be in his 40s or 50s, with dark hair and a stocky build. She couldn't remember any distinguishing features or provide information about the van's make, model, or license plate. However, the fact that this sighting occurred on the same afternoon as Jacob's disappearance, and that it involved a white van in the general vicinity of the boy's last known location, elevated its importance in Martinez's estimation. The detective began investigating whether any residents of Clearwater or the surrounding area owned white vans and had criminal records or histories of suspicious behavior. This research led her to a man named Patrick Donovan, a 41-year-old resident who lived approximately 2 miles outside Clearwater's town limits on a rural property bordering the Clearwater River. Donovan owned a white Chevrolet van registered in his name from 1988 through 1993. More significantly, Donovan had a prior arrest record from 1984 in California for loitering near a school playground. The charges had been dropped due to insufficient evidence, but the incident appeared in his background check. Martinez approached the investigation of Patrick Donovan with caution. She knew that owning a white van and having a single questionable incident in one's past did not constitute evidence of involvement in a child's disappearance. However, it warranted further examination. She began by researching Donovan's background and movements during June 1991. Donovan worked as an independent contractor, performing carpentry and handyman services throughout the region. His irregular schedule and frequent travel made it difficult to establish his whereabouts on any given day, including June 15th. In October 1996, Martinez interviewed several of Donovan's neighbors and former clients. Most described him as quiet and somewhat antisocial, but not overtly threatening or suspicious. One neighbor, however, mentioned that Donovan's property was quite isolated, with dense tree coverage and no nearby homes with direct views of his residence. The property included an old farmhouse and several outbuildings in various states of disrepair. The neighbor also noted that Donovan rarely had visitors and seemed to prefer solitude. Martinez obtained a warrant to interview Donovan directly. She approached him in November 1996 at his residence, accompanied by another detective. Donovan agreed to speak with them, though he appeared nervous and defensive. He denied any knowledge of Jacob Morrison's disappearance and stated that he had been working at a construction site in a neighboring county on June 15, 1991. When asked about his van, Donovan confirmed he had owned a white Chevrolet van during that period, but had sold it in 1993. He couldn't remember the name of the person who had purchased the vehicle and claimed he had no paperwork documenting the transaction. Martinez pressed Donovan about his 1984 arrest in California. He became visibly agitated, insisting that the charges had been dismissed and that he had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He refused to answer additional questions without an attorney present. Martinez attempted to verify Donovan's alibi for June 15, 1991, but found it impossible to confirm or refute his claim about working at a construction site 5 years earlier. Without physical evidence or witnesses directly connecting Donovan to Jacob Morrison, Martinez had no legal basis to search his property or pursue criminal charges. The Donovan lead, while promising, ultimately failed to advance the investigation. Martinez continued to monitor him periodically over the following years, but Donovan maintained a low profile and gave no indication of involvement in any criminal activity. In 2003, Martinez attempted one final interview with Donovan, hoping that time might have made him more willing to cooperate if he possessed any information about Jacob's disappearance. Donovan refused to meet with her, communicating through an attorney that he had nothing to add to his previous statements and requesting that police stop harassing him. Meanwhile, Jennifer Morrison never abandoned hope of finding her son or learning the truth about his fate. She became an advocate for missing children, working with organizations that supported families in similar situations. Every June, she organized search parties that combed through areas surrounding Clearwater that hadn't been thoroughly examined during the initial investigation. These searches occasionally turned up items that briefly raised hopes: old clothing, a child's shoe, a damaged bicycle, but none ever proved to be connected to Jacob. The Morrison family struggled under the weight of unresolved grief. Emily, Jacob's younger sister, grew up in the shadow of her brother's disappearance. She attended therapy throughout her teenage years, trying to process the trauma of losing her sibling under such mysterious circumstances. Jennifer's relationship with her ex-husband David deteriorated further as they dealt with their loss in different ways. David eventually remarried and moved to another state, while Jennifer remained in Clearwater, unable to leave the place where she had last seen her son. Detective Martinez refused to let the case fade into obscurity, even as other cold cases demanded attention. She periodically returned to the Jacob Morrison file, reviewing it for details she might have missed or new angles to pursue. She attended conferences on missing children investigations, learning about advances in forensic techniques and investigative methodologies that might be applicable to the case. She maintained the hope that someday, somehow, a breakthrough would emerge. As the years passed, witnesses aged, memories faded further, and the trail grew colder still. Patrick Donovan died in 2015 from complications related to heart disease, taking whatever knowledge he might have possessed to his grave. Detective Palmer, long retired, passed away in 2017, having never found the answers that haunted him throughout his career. The case file grew thicker with reports and updates, but no closer to resolution. By 2019, 28 years after Jacob Morrison had ridden his red bicycle to the quick stop and vanished, the investigation had essentially stalled. Martinez, now in her early 60s and contemplating retirement herself, had exhausted every conventional investigative avenue. The case remained officially open, but active leads had long since evaporated. Jennifer Morrison, approaching 60 years old, continued to hope for closure, though she had accepted that she might never learn what happened to her son. The town of Clearwater had changed significantly since 1991. The population had grown, new businesses had replaced old ones, and a younger generation had emerged with no direct memory of the Morrison case. The quick-stop convenience store had been renovated and changed ownership several times. Many of the families who had lived in the neighborhood during Jacob's disappearance had moved away. The case had become a piece of local history, a tragic story occasionally mentioned when discussing the town's past, but no longer at the forefront of community consciousness. What neither Martinez nor Jennifer Morrison knew in early 2019 was that the silence of those 28 years was about to be broken. An object had been waiting, preserved by glass and water, containing words written by a terrified child in desperate circumstances. That object was about to emerge from the Clearwater River, carrying with it the potential to finally answer the questions that had tormented a family and frustrated investigators for nearly 3 decades. The truth, long hidden, was preparing to resurface in the most unexpected way possible. March 17, 2019. The morning air carried a sharp chill as Stephen Blake prepared for his regular Sunday fishing expedition along the Clearwater River. Blake, a 54-year-old insurance adjuster who had lived in the area for 30 years, knew the river intimately. He understood its seasonal patterns, the best locations for catching steelhead and salmon, and the hidden spots where the current created ideal conditions for his hobby. On this particular morning, he chose a section of the river approximately 15 miles downstream from Clearwater's town center, an area where the water moved more slowly and created small pools among the rocks. Blake arrived at his chosen spot around 7:30, parking his truck on a dirt access road and hiking the remaining quarter-mile to the riverbank. The winter rains had subsided, but the river remained swollen from months of precipitation, its brown water carrying debris from upstream. As Blake set up his equipment, he noticed an unusual amount of refuse trapped among the rocks near the shore. Bottles, plastic containers, and various items swept downstream by the current and deposited in the calmer waters. Something caught Blake's attention as he prepared his first cast. Wedged tightly between 2 large rocks, partially submerged but visible above the waterline, was what appeared to be an old glass bottle. The bottle's shape and color suggested it dated from an earlier era, before plastic became the dominant material for beverage containers. Blake's curiosity was piqued. He had a minor interest in antiques and collectibles, and old bottles sometimes held value among certain collectors. Blake carefully made his way across the slippery rocks to examine the bottle more closely. As he reached it, he could see that it was indeed quite old, the glass showing signs of wear and discoloration from extended exposure to water and sediment. The bottle appeared to be a standard cola bottle from the early 1990s, a type that had since been largely replaced by plastic versions. What made Blake pause, however, was the presence of something inside the bottle. Through the clouded glass, he could make out what appeared to be a piece of paper, rolled tightly and inserted through the bottle's opening. Blake extracted the bottle from between the rocks with some effort. The cap remained sealed, though corroded by years of exposure to the elements. He held the bottle up to the morning light, attempting to see the paper more clearly through the glass. The paper appeared yellowed and water-damaged around its edges, but remarkably intact given the circumstances. Blake's initial thought was that this might be a message placed in the bottle by children playing near the river, perhaps decades earlier. Such discoveries were not uncommon along waterways. However, as Blake examined the bottle more closely, a sense of unease began to develop. The paper inside appeared to contain writing, and though he couldn't read the words through the glass, the handwriting seemed small and cramped, suggesting urgency or distress rather than playful childhood curiosity. Blake made a decision that would prove pivotal. Rather than opening the bottle himself, he would take it to the authorities and let them determine its contents and significance. Blake returned home and immediately contacted the Clearwater Police Department. The dispatcher who took his call expressed polite interest but seemed uncertain about the importance of an old bottle found in the river. Blake insisted that someone should examine the bottle's contents, emphasizing that something about the discovery felt significant. The dispatcher agreed to have an officer meet Blake at the police station within the hour. Detective Samuel Carter was reviewing case files when the desk sergeant informed him that a citizen had brought in a bottle containing what appeared to be a message. Carter, 46 years old and a 20-year veteran of the department, had worked alongside Angela Martinez on several cold cases and was familiar with the Jacob Morrison file. Carter agreed to meet with Blake, expecting to find nothing more than an old prank or perhaps a historical curiosity. Blake arrived at the police station at 9:15, carrying the bottle carefully wrapped in a towel. He handed it to Carter and explained the circumstances of its discovery, providing specific details about the location and the manner in which the bottle had been wedged between the rocks. Carter thanked Blake for bringing it in and assured him that the department would examine the contents appropriately. In the evidence processing room, Carter carefully photographed the bottle from multiple angles before attempting to open it. The corroded cap resisted his initial efforts, requiring the use of specialized tools to break the seal without damaging the bottle or its contents. When the cap finally gave way, Carter carefully extracted the rolled paper, using long tweezers, taking care not to tear the fragile material. The paper unrolled to reveal handwriting in pencil, faded but still legible. Carter's breath caught as he read the first line. The message identified the writer as Jacob Morrison and stated that he was being held against his will. The handwriting was clearly that of a child, with uneven letters and simple sentence structure. The message provided specific details that only someone close to the Morrison family would know, including the nickname Jacob's mother used for him and a reference to his red bicycle. Carter immediately contacted Detective Martinez, who had officially retired in 2018 but remained closely connected to the department and the Morrison case. Martinez arrived at the station within 30 minutes, her retirement forgotten in the face of this extraordinary development. Together, they examined the message carefully, documenting every word and detail. The note explained that Jacob had been taken by a man in a white van. He described being held in a location near water, where he could hear the river. The message indicated that Jacob had managed to find a bottle and paper during a brief moment when his captor was distracted. He had written the note quickly, sealed it in the bottle, and thrown it into the river, hoping it would be found. The message ended with a desperate plea for help and a statement that he was afraid. Martinez contacted Jennifer Morrison immediately. The conversation was brief, with Martinez providing only essential information and requesting that Jennifer come to the station as quickly as possible. When Jennifer arrived, accompanied by her daughter Emily, now 40 years old, Martinez showed them the message. Jennifer's reaction confirmed what the detectives already believed. She recognized her son's handwriting immediately and confirmed details in the message that only Jacob would have known. The discovery of the bottle transformed the Morrison case from a cold file into an active investigation. Carter assembled a team of detectives and forensic specialists to analyze every aspect of the bottle and its contents. The paper was sent to the State Crime Lab for dating and analysis. Forensic document examiners studied the handwriting, confirming it was consistent with samples of Jacob's writing from his school notebooks. The bottle itself was examined for fingerprints, though the extended exposure to water and elements made it unlikely that usable prints would be recovered. Hydrologists were consulted to determine the bottle's likely point of origin. By analyzing the river's currents, seasonal flow patterns, and the specific location where the bottle was discovered, experts developed a profile of possible areas where the bottle might have entered the water. The analysis suggested that the bottle had likely been deposited in the river somewhere within a 10-mile stretch upstream from where Blake found it, in an area that included both rural properties and undeveloped wilderness. The forensic analysis of the paper yielded crucial information. The paper was identified as standard notebook paper from the early 1990s, consistent with the type Jacob would have had access to at school. The pencil markings were analyzed and dated to approximately 1991 or 1992, supporting the timeline of Jacob's disappearance. Most significantly, small traces of soil and organic matter embedded in the paper's fibers were recovered and analyzed, providing clues about the environment where the message had been written. Martinez focused her attention on the geographical analysis. If Jacob had been held near the river and had managed to throw the bottle into the water, the location had to meet specific criteria. It needed to be close enough to the river for a child to reach it, isolated enough that a captive could be held without detection, and positioned such that a bottle entering the water at that point would eventually travel downstream to where Blake found it nearly 3 decades later. The investigation team created detailed maps marking every property, structure, and accessible point along the relevant stretch of river. They cross-referenced these locations with property records from 1991, identifying who had owned or occupied each site during the period of Jacob's disappearance. One name appeared on this list that immediately captured Martinez's attention. Patrick Donovan had owned property along the river in exactly the area identified by the hydrological analysis. Donovan's former property, sold in 1994 to a family named the Hendersons, was located approximately 12 miles upstream from where Blake discovered the bottle. The property included an old farmhouse, several outbuildings, and direct access to the river through a wooded area. Martinez recalled her investigations of Donovan during the late 1990s and early 2000s, remembering that she had never obtained legal authority to search his property due to insufficient evidence. Carter and Martinez visited the Henderson family, who had owned the former Donovan property for 25 years. The Hendersons were cooperative, though surprised by the police interest in their land. They explained that when they purchased the property in 1994, it had been in poor condition, with several structures in need of significant repair. They had renovated the main house and demolished one of the outbuildings that had been deemed structurally unsound. The remaining outbuildings were used for storage and had not been substantially altered since the purchase. The detectives requested permission to search the property, explaining the connection to the Morrison case without providing specific details that might compromise the investigation. The Hendersons agreed immediately, expressing shock at the possibility that their property might be connected to such a tragedy. Carter obtained a formal search warrant as a procedural safeguard, and within 24 hours, a full forensic team descended on the property. The search focused initially on the remaining outbuildings and the areas closest to the river. Cadaver dogs were brought in to detect any signs of human remains. Ground-penetrating radar was used to identify any disturbances in the soil that might indicate burial sites. The team worked methodically, documenting every finding and collecting samples from areas that showed any signs of historical disturbance. On the second day of the search, investigators examining the basement of the main house made a significant discovery. Behind a wall that the Hendersons had planned to remove during a future renovation, the team found a small, concealed space that had been sealed off. The space measured approximately 8 feet by 10 feet and showed signs of having been modified to serve as a hidden room. Ventilation holes had been drilled through to the exterior, and the door, now removed, had featured a lock on the outside. Inside this concealed space, forensic teams discovered evidence that would prove crucial to the investigation. Fragments of fabric were recovered from the floor, later identified as consistent with children's clothing from the early 1990s. More significantly, investigators found remnants of paper and pencil shavings, suggesting that writing materials had been present in the room. DNA samples were collected from various surfaces, though the extended time period meant that degradation would likely limit the usefulness of such evidence. The discovery of the hidden room, combined with the bottle's message and the property's connection to Patrick Donovan, provided the first substantial evidence in the Morrison case since Jacob's disappearance 28 years earlier. However, Donovan's death in 2015 meant that he could never be questioned or held accountable for whatever role he may have played. The investigation had reached a critical juncture, with evidence suggesting what had happened, but no living suspect to prosecute. Martinez refused to accept this dead end. She knew from her earlier investigations that Donovan had not lived alone on the property during the early 1990s. Records indicated he had a younger brother who had resided with him for several years. This brother had never been thoroughly investigated because he had moved away before Martinez began focusing on Patrick Donovan in the mid-1990s. Now, this overlooked detail suddenly became the key to potentially solving a case that had remained unsolved for nearly 3 decades. The investigators were about to discover that some secrets, even when buried deep, eventually find their way back to the surface. March 25, 2019. The investigation into Jacob Morrison's disappearance entered a new phase as Detective Samuel Carter and retired Detective Angela Martinez focused their attention on Gregory Donovan, Patrick's younger brother. Martinez had encountered Gregory's name during her earlier investigations of Patrick in the late 1990s, but at that time, Gregory had already left Oregon and establishing contact had seemed less urgent than pursuing other leads. Now, with concrete evidence linking Patrick's property to Jacob's captivity, Gregory became a person of critical interest. The investigative team began by compiling a comprehensive background on Gregory Donovan. Records showed that he had lived with his brother Patrick from 1989 through 1995, during which time he worked various manual labor jobs in the Clearwater area. In 1995, shortly after Patrick sold the Riverside property, Gregory had moved to Northern California. He had lived in several different cities over the subsequent years, working primarily in construction and warehouse positions. Most significantly, Martinez discovered that Gregory had legally changed his name in 2004 to Gregory Daniels, a fact that explained why he had been difficult to locate during earlier investigation attempts. Carter obtained Gregory's current address in Sacramento, California, where he had been living for the past 8 years. The detective coordinated with Sacramento Police Department to establish surveillance on Gregory before approaching him directly. The surveillance revealed that Gregory, now 62 years old, maintained a quiet, routine-oriented lifestyle. He worked as a night custodian at a commercial office building and lived alone in a small apartment. He had no known criminal record beyond minor traffic violations and appeared to have no close social connections. On March 28th, Carter and Martinez traveled to Sacramento, accompanied by 2 local detectives. They approached Gregory at his apartment early in the morning, before he left for work. Gregory answered the door appearing surprised, but not particularly alarmed by the presence of law enforcement. When Carter identified himself and explained that they needed to speak with him about his brother Patrick and events from 1991, Gregory's demeanor shifted noticeably. He became tense and guarded, but agreed to accompany the detectives to the police station for questioning. At the station, Gregory was informed that he was not under arrest, but that investigators wanted to discuss his knowledge of his brother's activities during the early 1990s. Gregory initially maintained that he knew nothing about any crimes his brother might have committed. He acknowledged living with Patrick during that period, but claimed he had worked long hours and spent little time at the property. When shown photographs of the concealed room discovered in the basement, Gregory stated he had never seen that space and suggested it might have been constructed after he moved away. Carter then presented Gregory with copies of the message found in the bottle. He explained that forensic evidence placed Jacob Morrison at Patrick's property for an extended period in 1991 and possibly into 1992. The detective made it clear that anyone who had knowledge of a child being held captive and failed to report it or assist the victim could face serious criminal charges, even decades after the fact. Gregory's composure began to deteriorate. He requested an attorney. The questioning session ended, but investigators had observed enough of Gregory's reactions to believe he possessed significant knowledge about Jacob's fate. Over the following days, Carter worked with prosecutors to determine what charges could potentially be filed against Gregory based on existing evidence. The legal team determined that if Gregory had been aware of Jacob's captivity and had taken any action to conceal it or assist his brother in avoiding detection, he could be charged with multiple felonies, including conspiracy, accessory after the fact, and obstruction of justice. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of evidence from the Donovan property continued. DNA recovered from the hidden room was degraded but sufficient for analysis. The results showed genetic material from at least 2 individuals. One profile was incomplete, but showed markers consistent with the Morrison family's DNA, which had been obtained from Jennifer and Emily for comparison purposes. The second profile was more complete and was entered into the National DNA Database for comparison. The DNA database search produced a partial match to Gregory Donovan. The match was not complete enough to serve as definitive proof that Gregory had been in the hidden room, but it established that a close genetic relative of his had been present in that space. Given that Patrick Donovan was deceased and unable to provide a DNA sample, and that no other Donovan family members had been identified, the partial match significantly strengthened the case against Gregory as someone who had at minimum been present at the location where Jacob was held. On April 3rd, prosecutors felt they had sufficient evidence to file criminal charges against Gregory. He was arrested at his apartment and formally charged with conspiracy to commit kidnapping, being an accessory after the fact to kidnapping, and obstruction of justice. The charges carried potential sentences totaling up to 40 years in prison. Gregory was held without bail, deemed a flight risk due to his history of relocating and changing his identity. Gregory's attorney, a public defender named Amanda Foster, began working to negotiate a potential plea agreement. She recognized that while the physical evidence against Gregory was not overwhelming, the circumstantial case was strong, particularly when combined with his suspicious behavior during questioning and his history of name changes and relocations. Foster approached prosecutors with a proposition. Gregory would provide detailed information about Jacob Morrison's captivity and fate in exchange for a reduced sentence. The negotiations proceeded carefully over several weeks. Prosecutors insisted that any agreement would require Gregory to provide truthful and complete information that could be independently verified. They also stipulated that Jennifer Morrison would need to be consulted and would have the opportunity to provide input on any plea arrangement. Jennifer, though devastated by the developments, agreed to consider a plea deal if it would finally provide definitive answers about what had happened to her son. On April 22nd, Gregory Donovan agreed to cooperate fully with investigators. In a series of interviews conducted over 3 days, with his attorney present throughout, Gregory provided a detailed account of the events surrounding Jacob Morrison's disappearance and captivity. His statement, while disturbing in its content, was delivered in a matter-of-fact tone that suggested emotional detachment from the gravity of what he was describing. According to Gregory's account, Patrick had been planning to abduct a child for several months before June 1991. He had observed children in Clearwater, studying their routines and identifying potential targets. Jacob Morrison had attracted Patrick's attention because the boy frequently rode his bicycle alone and appeared to follow predictable patterns. On June 15th, Patrick had been waiting in his white van near the quick stop, anticipating that Jacob might visit the store that afternoon. When Jacob emerged from the convenience store and began riding his bicycle home, Patrick followed him in the van. At a point along 5th Street, where residential properties backed onto a small wooded area, Patrick had pulled alongside Jacob and forced him into the van. The entire abduction had taken less than 30 seconds. Patrick then drove directly to his Riverside property, where he brought Jacob to the concealed room in the basement that he had prepared in advance. Gregory claimed that he had been at work during the abduction and had not learned about Jacob's presence at the property until he returned home that evening. He stated that Patrick had told him that Jacob was there and that Gregory needed to remain silent about it or face consequences. Gregory portrayed himself as frightened of his older brother and intimidated into compliance. He admitted that over the following months, he had been aware of Jacob's presence in the hidden room, but had taken no action to help the boy or alert authorities. According to Gregory's statement, Jacob had been held in the concealed room for approximately 8 months. Patrick had provided minimal food and water, keeping the boy weak and compliant. Gregory claimed that his only direct interaction with Jacob had been to occasionally deliver food when Patrick was away from the property. He stated that Jacob had repeatedly begged for help, but that Gregory had been too afraid of Patrick to intervene. The statement addressed the bottle message directly. Gregory recalled that in late February or early March of 1992, Patrick had been away from the property for several hours. During this time, Jacob had somehow managed to escape from the locked room, though Gregory was unclear about how this had been accomplished. Jacob had gone upstairs and found paper and a pencil. He had written the message and apparently taken a bottle from the kitchen. Gregory claimed he had been sleeping and had not witnessed these events. When Patrick returned and discovered that Jacob had temporarily escaped, he had been enraged. Gregory's statement became vague at this point, with him claiming that he did not know exactly what happened next. He stated that Jacob had apparently managed to reach the river and throw the bottle into the water before Patrick caught him. After this incident, according to Gregory, Jacob had been returned to the hidden room with additional security measures to prevent another escape. Gregory then provided the information that investigators most needed, though dreaded hearing. He stated that Jacob had died in April 1992, approximately 2 months after the bottle incident. Gregory claimed the death had resulted from complications related to malnutrition and the harsh conditions of his captivity, though he acknowledged he had no medical expertise to make such a determination. He stated that Patrick had buried Jacob's remains somewhere on the property, but Gregory claimed not to know the exact location because Patrick had done this alone during a time when Gregory was away at work. The information about Jacob's burial site led to an intensification of the search efforts at the former Donovan property. The Henderson family, horrified by the revelations, gave investigators unlimited access to their land. Ground-penetrating radar specialists conducted extensive surveys of the entire property, focusing particular attention on areas that appeared to have been disturbed during the relevant time period. Cadaver dogs were brought back to sweep areas that had not been thoroughly examined during the initial search. On May 1, 2019, investigators made the discovery that would provide final confirmation of Gregory's account. In a remote section of the property, approximately 200 yards from the main house and close to the river, ground-penetrating radar detected an anomaly consistent with a burial. Careful excavation revealed human remains buried approximately 4 feet below the surface. The remains were those of a juvenile, and the positioning and context of the burial suggested they had been placed there hurriedly and without ceremony. The remains were transported to the state medical examiner's office for analysis. Despite nearly 3 decades of decomposition, forensic anthropologists were able to establish key facts about the deceased. The skeletal remains were consistent with a male child approximately 12 years old. Several identifying characteristics matched Jacob Morrison's known physical features, including a healed fracture in his left forearm that Jacob had sustained in a playground accident when he was 9 years old. Dental records, preserved from Jacob's last visit to the dentist just months before his disappearance, provided definitive identification. The remains were conclusively those of Jacob Morrison. The medical examiner's analysis could not determine a precise cause of death due to the extent of decomposition and the absence of soft tissue. However, the examination revealed multiple healed fractures in the ribs and other bones, consistent with extended physical trauma. The overall condition of the remains supported Gregory's claim that Jacob had suffered from severe malnutrition and had been subjected to harsh conditions for an extended period. The estimated time of death, based on various forensic indicators, was consistent with the spring of 1992. Jennifer Morrison received the news that her son's remains had been found on May 2nd. The call she had waited 28 years to receive brought not relief, but a crushing finality. The faint hope she had maintained throughout nearly 3 decades that Jacob might somehow still be alive was extinguished. However, the confirmation also provided something she had lacked for all those years: certainty. She finally knew what had happened to her son, and she could finally lay him to rest. The discovery of Jacob's remains and Gregory's confession created a clear path forward for prosecutors. Gregory pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a sentence of 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. While many felt this sentence was insufficient given the gravity of his crimes, prosecutors explained that proving Gregory's direct involvement in Jacob's death would have been difficult, and the plea agreement guaranteed a substantial prison term while sparing the Morrison family the trauma of a lengthy trial. The case that had haunted Clearwater for nearly 3 decades was finally approaching resolution. Jacob Morrison's story had come full circle from a sunny afternoon in 1991 to a small glass bottle discovered in 2019. The message he had managed to write and send down the river had ultimately accomplished what he had desperately hoped. It had brought help, though tragically too late to save him. The bottle had drifted through the water for 28 years, preserving his words and waiting for the moment when it would finally tell the world what had happened to a 12-year-old boy who just wanted to go home. May 15, 2019. The Morrison case had reached a critical phase where investigators worked to construct a complete timeline of events and verify every element of Gregory Donovan's confession. Detective Samuel Carter understood that while Gregory had provided substantial information, gaps remained in the narrative. The prosecution needed to establish beyond doubt that Gregory's account was truthful and that no additional perpetrators or accomplices had been involved in Jacob's abduction and captivity. Carter assembled a specialized team to examine every aspect of the case from multiple angles. Forensic accountants reviewed Patrick Donovan's financial records from 1991 and 1992, searching for purchases that might corroborate the timeline Gregory had provided. Bank statements revealed that Patrick had made cash withdrawals totaling several $1,000s during the months Jacob was allegedly held captive. While the specific use of these funds could not be determined, the pattern was consistent with someone needing to purchase supplies while avoiding creating a detailed transaction record. Investigators also examined Gregory's financial records from the same period, His bank account showed regular deposits from his employer, but no unusual transactions or withdrawals. This financial evidence supported Gregory's claim that he had not been an active participant in Jacob's abduction, though it did not absolve him of responsibility for his failure to report the crime or assist the victim. The forensic examination of the Donovan property continued to yield important evidence. Investigators conducted a detailed analysis of the basement area, documenting every aspect of the concealed room's construction. The room had been built with deliberate planning, featuring soundproofing materials in the walls and a ventilation system that drew air from outside the house. The door had been reinforced and fitted with a commercial-grade lock. These modifications would have required time, materials, and some construction expertise, supporting the assertion that Patrick had planned the abduction in advance rather than acting impulsively. Soil samples from the area where Jacob's remains were discovered underwent extensive analysis. Forensic botanists examined plant matter and root structures to determine when the soil had been disturbed. Their analysis indicated that the burial had occurred during the early spring of 1992, consistent with Gregory's statement about the timing of Jacob's death. Additionally, soil composition from the burial site matched soil samples found on tools discovered in one of the property's outbuildings, providing physical evidence linking the burial to the Donovan property. Carter returned to the witness interviews from 1991, re-examining statements in light of the new information. Several witnesses who had reported seeing a white van in the area during the period of Jacob's disappearance were contacted again. While most could provide no additional useful information after so many years, one witness offered a detail that had seemed insignificant in 1991 but now took on new meaning. A woman named Melissa Carter, no relation to Detective Carter, had reported seeing a white van parked near a hiking trail that provided access to the river approximately 1 mile from Patrick Donovan's property. She had noticed the van because it had remained in the same location for several hours on a weekday afternoon, which struck her as unusual for that remote area. The timeline Melissa provided placed this sighting in late February 1992, precisely the period when Jacob had allegedly escaped briefly and thrown the bottle into the river. This corroboration of Gregory's account strengthened the prosecution's case and suggested that Patrick may have used the van to access the river area while searching for Jacob after his momentary escape. Investigators also sought to understand how Jacob had managed to obtain the materials needed to write his message. The forensic analysis of the paper and pencil markings had established that standard notebook paper and a common wooden pencil had been used. Gregory's statement indicated that Jacob had found these materials upstairs in the main house during his brief escape. A search of items the Henderson family had stored from the original contents of the house revealed several boxes of old household items that had been left behind when the Donovans sold the property. Among these items were notebooks and writing implements matching those identified in the forensic analysis, providing physical confirmation of this aspect of Gregory's account. The bottle itself underwent additional specialized examination. Experts in historical containers identified it as a standard cola bottle manufactured between 1989 and 1993. The bottle's cap showed corrosion patterns consistent with having been sealed for an extended period in a river environment. Microscopic analysis of sediment deposits on the bottle's exterior allowed researchers to map its probable journey down the river, confirming that it could have entered the water in the area near the Donovan property and traveled the distance to where Stephen Blake discovered it. As these investigative threads came together, Carter worked closely with prosecutors to prepare for Gregory Donovan's formal sentencing hearing. While Gregory had pleaded guilty as part of his cooperation agreement, the hearing would provide an opportunity for victim impact statements and would establish the final terms of his imprisonment. Jennifer Morrison prepared a statement she would deliver at the hearing, working with a victim advocate to articulate the devastating impact of Jacob's loss on her family. Emily Morrison, now 40 years old, also prepared to address the court. Emily had been 8 years old when her brother disappeared, and she had spent her entire adult life in the shadow of that trauma. She had struggled with anxiety and depression throughout her teenage years and 20s, always wondering whether Jacob might somehow return. The discovery of his remains had provided the closure she needed to begin truly processing her grief. but it had also reopened wounds that had never properly healed. The investigation team made efforts to locate other potential witnesses who might have had contact with the Donovan brothers during the relevant period. Former co-workers of both Patrick and Gregory were interviewed, though most had only superficial knowledge of the brothers' personal lives. Several former co-workers described Patrick as antisocial and occasionally aggressive, while Gregory was remembered as quiet and somewhat subservient to his older brother. None reported having suspected anything criminal about the brothers' activities. One particularly significant interview involved a woman named Christina Walsh, who had briefly dated Patrick Donovan in early 1991, several months before Jacob's abduction. Christina had never been interviewed during the original investigation because she had ended the relationship and moved away from Clearwater before Jacob's disappearance became widely known. When investigators located her in 2019, she provided disturbing insights into Patrick's character and mindset. Christina described Patrick as controlling and possessive during their brief relationship. She stated that he had made comments about children that had made her uncomfortable, though she had not interpreted these remarks as indicating criminal intent at the time. Most significantly, Christina recalled that Patrick had shown her the basement of his house during one of her visits, and she had noticed that he was in the process of making modifications to the space. When she asked about the construction work, Patrick had deflected her questions and quickly guided her away from the basement. Christina had found this behavior odd, but had not pursued the matter. The relationship ended shortly thereafter due to Patrick's increasingly controlling behavior. This testimony provided evidence that Patrick had been preparing the concealed room several months before Jacob's abduction, further demonstrating premeditation and planning. It also suggested that Patrick's interest in children had manifested in observable ways that others had noticed but not reported to authorities. As the investigation continued, Carter discovered additional information about Patrick Donovan's background prior to his arrival in Oregon. Records showed that Patrick had lived in California during the 1980s and had moved to Oregon in 1988. Carter contacted law enforcement agencies in the California jurisdictions where Patrick had resided, inquiring about any unsolved cases involving missing children during the period Patrick lived in those areas. This inquiry produced troubling results. 2 cases of missing children in California during the mid-1980s had occurred in areas where Patrick had lived. One case from 1985 involved a 9-year-old boy who had disappeared while riding his bicycle home from school. Another case from 1987 involved an 11-year-old girl who had vanished from a shopping center parking lot. Both cases remained unsolved, and both involved circumstances that showed some similarities to Jacob Morrison's abduction. Carter shared this information with California law enforcement agencies, and those departments reopened their investigations with Patrick Donovan as a potential suspect. While the passage of time and the lack of physical evidence made it unlikely that definitive conclusions could be reached about these older cases, the possibility that Patrick had been responsible for multiple abductions added another dimension to the Morrison case. It suggested that Jacob's abduction had not been an isolated incident, but rather part of a pattern of predatory behavior spanning potentially decades. Gregory's cooperation with investigators extended to questions about his brother's possible involvement in other crimes. However, Gregory maintained that he had no knowledge of Patrick committing any offenses prior to Jacob's abduction. He stated that he had only moved in with Patrick in 1989 and had not been aware of his brother's activities during the years Patrick lived in California. Investigators could not determine whether Gregory was being truthful about this or whether he was protecting his brother's memory by refusing to implicate him in additional crimes. The question of why Gregory had remained silent for so long, both during Jacob's captivity and in the 27 years after the boy's death, became a focus of psychological evaluation. Court-appointed mental health professionals examined Gregory to assess his competency and to understand his motivations and psychological state. These evaluations revealed that Gregory had a dependent personality structure and had maintained a deeply submissive relationship with his older brother throughout his life. The psychologists noted that while this dynamic might help explain Gregory's initial failure to report Jacob's captivity, it did not excuse his continued silence for decades after Patrick's death. As the sentencing date approached, the complete picture of what had happened to Jacob Morrison had finally emerged. A 12-year-old boy who had simply wanted to buy a soda on a summer afternoon had been targeted by a predator who had been watching and planning. Jacob had been taken within seconds in a quiet residential neighborhood and transported to a concealed room where he had been held for 8 months. During that time, he had somehow maintained hope that he might be rescued, ultimately finding a way to create a message and send it out into the world. That message had traveled through water and time, waiting nearly 3 decades before it would be discovered and would finally bring answers to those who had never stopped searching for the truth. The case had exposed failures in the original investigation, revealed the existence of a predator who had likely committed crimes spanning multiple states and many years, and demonstrated the devastating consequences of one person's choice to remain silent in the face of ongoing criminal activity. As Jennifer Morrison prepared to face Gregory Donovan in court and finally have the opportunity to confront the man who had allowed her son to suffer and die, the community of Clearwater prepared to close a chapter of its history that had remained painfully open for 28 years. June 15, 2019. 28 years to the day after Jacob Morrison disappeared, the Clearwater County Courthouse prepared for Gregory Donovan's sentencing hearing. The date had been deliberately chosen by prosecutors in consultation with Jennifer Morrison, who felt that marking this anniversary with a step toward justice was important for her healing process. The courtroom filled early with media representatives, community members who remembered the original case, and advocates for victims of violent crime. Security was heightened due to concerns about emotional reactions to the proceedings. Judge Elizabeth Thornton presided over the hearing. Thornton, a 62-year-old jurist with 30 years of legal experience, had been assigned to the case specifically because of her extensive background in complex criminal matters and her reputation for fairness combined with firm sentencing standards. She had reviewed all the evidence, read the detailed pre-sentencing report, and familiarized herself with every aspect of the case before entering the courtroom that morning. The proceedings began with prosecutors presenting a comprehensive summary of the evidence against Gregory Donovan and the terms of his plea agreement. Assistant District Attorney Michael Chen outlined the charges to which Gregory had pleaded guilty: conspiracy to commit kidnapping, accessory after the fact to kidnapping, and obstruction of justice. Chen explained that while more serious charges might have been pursued, the plea agreement had been accepted because it guaranteed a substantial prison sentence while providing the Morrison family with definitive answers about Jacob's fate. Chen's presentation included a detailed timeline of Jacob's captivity based on Gregory's confession and the physical evidence recovered during the investigation. The prosecutor described how Jacob had been held in a concealed room for approximately 8 months, suffering from malnutrition and living in conditions that constituted severe psychological and physical abuse. Chen emphasized that while Patrick Donovan had been the primary perpetrator, Gregory's awareness of Jacob's captivity and his deliberate choice to do nothing made him criminally culpable for the boy's suffering and death. The prosecution then presented evidence of Gregory's actions following Patrick's death in 2015. Records showed that Gregory had made no attempt to contact authorities or reveal information about Jacob's case even after his brother could no longer pose a threat to him. This continued silence, maintained for an additional 4 years after Patrick's death, demonstrated that Gregory's failure to act had not been solely the result of fear, but reflected a conscious decision to protect himself and his brother's memory from legal consequences. Following the prosecution's presentation, Gregory's defense attorney, Amanda Foster, addressed the court. Foster acknowledged the severity of her client's crimes, but argued for consideration of mitigating factors. She presented psychological evaluations showing that Gregory had suffered significant abuse from Patrick during their childhood and had developed a pathological dependence on his older brother's approval. Foster argued that Gregory's personality structure and his history of victimization by Patrick had impaired his ability to act independently or make appropriate moral decisions when confronted with his brother's criminal behavior. Foster also emphasized Gregory's cooperation with investigators following his arrest. She noted that without Gregory's detailed confession, Jacob's remains might never have been located, and the family would have continued to live without closure. The attorney argued that while this cooperation could not excuse Gregory's crimes, it demonstrated some capacity for accepting responsibility and deserved acknowledgement in the sentencing calculation. Judge Thornton listened carefully to both presentations before announcing that the court would hear victim impact statements. Jennifer Morrison was the first to address the court. Now 60 years old, she walked slowly to the podium, carrying a photograph of Jacob taken shortly before his disappearance. She placed the photograph where Gregory could see it clearly, then began to speak. Jennifer's statement detailed the 28 years of anguish her family had endured. She described the initial terror of not knowing what had happened to her son, followed by years of diminishing hope that he might still be alive. She spoke about the impact on her daughter Emily, who had grown up with the trauma of losing her brother under mysterious circumstances. Jennifer described how the uncertainty had affected every aspect of her life, making it impossible to move forward or find peace. She explained that even now, with answers finally provided, the knowledge of what Jacob had suffered during his captivity was almost unbearable to contemplate. Jennifer directed her remarks to Gregory, stating that while she understood he had been afraid of his brother, he had made a choice every single day for 28 years to remain silent. She emphasized that after Patrick's death, Gregory could have come forward without fear, but had chosen continued silence. Jennifer stated that she could never forgive Gregory for allowing her son to suffer and for depriving her family of closure for nearly 3 decades. She asked the judge to impose the maximum sentence permitted under the plea agreement. Emily Morrison spoke next, describing her experience of growing up as the sister of a missing child. She explained how the disappearance had defined her entire childhood and adolescence, creating a constant atmosphere of grief and uncertainty in her home. Emily spoke about the therapy she had required to process the trauma and the difficulty she had experienced forming normal relationships because of the fear and anxiety that had been instilled in her at such a young age. She stated that learning the truth about Jacob's fate had been devastating but necessary, and she thanked investigators for their persistence in solving the case. Several community members also provided statements, including Michelle Reynolds, the former Quick Stop clerk who had seen Jacob on the last day of his life. Michelle spoke about the guilt she had carried for years, wondering if there had been something she could have noticed or done differently that might have prevented Jacob's abduction. She addressed Gregory directly, expressing anger that he had allowed the community to suffer alongside the Morrison family when he possessed information that could have provided answers years earlier. Detective Angela Martinez, now fully retired, provided a statement from the perspective of law enforcement. Martinez described the frustration of investigating a case with so few leads and the dedication of multiple generations of investigators who had refused to let Jacob's disappearance be forgotten. She spoke about the significance of the bottle discovery and how it had reinvigorated the investigation, ultimately leading to the resolution. Martinez emphasized that this case demonstrated the importance of persistence in cold case investigations and the reality that justice, while sometimes delayed, could still be achieved. After all statements had been heard, Judge Thornton took a brief recess to consider the materials before her. When the court reconvened, the judge delivered her sentencing decision. Thornton acknowledged the arguments presented by both the prosecution and defense, noting that the case involved extraordinary circumstances and profound moral failures. She stated that while Gregory's psychological history and cooperation were relevant factors, they could not significantly mitigate the severity of his crimes. Judge Thornton sentenced Gregory Donovan to 25 years in the Oregon State Penitentiary without the possibility of parole, the maximum term permitted under his plea agreement. The judge specified that Gregory would serve this sentence in administrative segregation for his own protection, given the nature of his crimes and the likelihood that he would be targeted by other inmates. Thornton also ordered Gregory to pay restitution to the Morrison family, though she acknowledged that his limited financial resources made it unlikely that significant compensation would ever be collected. In her remarks accompanying the sentence, Judge Thornton stated that Gregory's crimes represented a fundamental betrayal of basic human decency. She noted that his choice to remain silent in the face of a child's suffering and the family's anguish reflected a moral vacancy that warranted severe punishment. The judge emphasized that Gregory had possessed the power to end Jacob's suffering and to provide the Morrison family with answers, but had repeatedly chosen his own interests over the welfare of others. Thornton stated that the sentence reflected society's condemnation of such choices and served as a message that those who enable or conceal violent crimes would be held accountable regardless of how much time had passed. Following the sentencing, prosecutors announced that they were working with California law enforcement agencies to investigate Patrick Donovan's potential connection to other unsolved missing children cases. While Patrick could no longer be prosecuted due to his death, investigators hoped to provide closure to additional families and to establish a complete understanding of the scope of his criminal activities. This announcement brought renewed attention to older cases and prompted several families to contact authorities with information about their missing children. The Morrison family held a small private funeral for Jacob in late June 2019. Jennifer had delayed this final goodbye until after the sentencing, feeling that she could not properly lay her son to rest until justice had been served. The funeral was attended by close family members, a few of Jacob's childhood friends who had maintained contact with Jennifer over the years, and several investigators who had worked on the case. Jacob was buried in the Clearwater Cemetery, his headstone marking both his birth in 1979 and his death in 1992, finally establishing the complete timeline of his brief life. In the months following the sentencing, Jennifer Morrison became an advocate for missing children, working with organizations that supported families dealing with similar tragedies. She spoke publicly about the importance of maintaining hope, while also acknowledging the need to accept difficult truths when evidence finally emerged. Jennifer also advocated for improved coordination between law enforcement agencies in tracking and investigating potential serial offenders who might move between jurisdictions. The town of Clearwater organized a memorial in Jacob's honor, installing a bench near the Quick Stop convenience store with a plaque commemorating his life. The memorial served as both a tribute to Jacob and a reminder to the community about the importance of vigilance and the reality that tragedy could strike even in seemingly safe neighborhoods. Local schools implemented enhanced safety protocols and educational programs teaching children about personal safety and the importance of immediately reporting suspicious behavior to trusted adults. Detective Samuel Carter received a commendation from the Clearwater Police Department for his work on the case, though he was quick to credit the collaborative efforts of multiple investigators across several decades. Carter emphasized that the resolution had been possible only because previous investigators, particularly Richard Palmer and Angela Martinez, had maintained meticulous records and had refused to close the case despite years without progress. Carter stated that the Morrison case would serve as a model for how cold case investigations should be conducted, demonstrating that persistence and systematic review of evidence could eventually yield results even after many years. The bottle that had contained Jacob's message was preserved as evidence, but was later offered to Jennifer Morrison after the conclusion of all legal proceedings. Jennifer declined to keep the bottle, feeling that having it in her possession would be too painful a reminder of her son's suffering. Instead, she donated it to a museum dedicated to criminal justice history, where it would serve as an educational tool and a testament to one boy's desperate attempt to communicate with the outside world during his captivity. As the first anniversary of the bottle's discovery approached in March 2020, Jennifer Morrison reflected on the journey from uncertainty to terrible knowledge to a measure of peace. She acknowledged that learning the truth about Jacob's fate had been devastating, but stated that uncertainty had been a different kind of torture that had made healing impossible. With definitive answers finally provided and justice served to the extent possible given the circumstances, Jennifer reported feeling that she could finally begin to move forward with her life while honoring Jacob's memory. The Morrison case became a subject of study in criminal justice programs, examined as an example of both investigative persistence and the tragic consequences of bystander inaction. Prosecutors used Gregory Donovan's case in training materials to illustrate the legal principle that those who knowingly facilitate or conceal serious crimes can be held criminally responsible even if they were not primary perpetrators. The case also prompted discussions about mandatory reporting laws and the moral and legal obligations of individuals who become aware of ongoing criminal activity. In the years following the resolution of the case, the Clearwater River continued to flow as it always had, carrying water from the mountains to the sea. The spot where Stephen Blake had discovered the bottle became a place of quiet reflection for some community members who would occasionally visit to consider the improbable journey that had brought Jacob's message back to the surface after 28 years. The river, which had carried away a boy's desperate plea for help, had eventually returned it at precisely the moment when advances in forensic science and a dedicated investigative team could finally provide the answers that had eluded discovery for so long. Jacob Morrison's story, while ending in tragedy, ultimately demonstrated that even in the darkest circumstances, truth could emerge and justice could be served. The message in the bottle had accomplished what its young author had hoped. It had brought help, had exposed those responsible for his suffering, and had finally allowed his family to know his fate and honor his memory. In death, as in life, Jacob Morrison had been a brave child who had done everything within his power to make things right. His legacy would live on in the improvements to child safety protocols, in the families who found closure through similar cold case investigations, and in the memory of a community that had never forgotten one of its lost children.